A group of arrogant bikers stand in front of Cedar Creek's only diner, their Harleys gleaming under the morning sun. Their target is a blind veteran and his Belgian Malinois service dog trying to enjoy breakfast. The bikers mock the veteran's disability, making crude gestures and threatening his dog. What these thugs fail to realize is that Marcus Stone lost his sight serving as an elite force recon marine in Afghanistan, where he and his K9 partner Shadow eliminated high-value targets with lethal precision. Their cruel taunts trigger something deadly in both man and dog. Shadow's military-trained nose detects the bitter scent of chemical precursors, the same ones they hunted during counter-narcotics operations overseas. Marcus's enhanced hearing picks up whispered conversations about shipments and protected routes. In one thoughtless moment, these bikers have exposed their connection to a massive cartel operation poisoning this small town. Now Marcus must decide whether to maintain his peaceful facade or unleash the combat skills that made him a legend in the Corps. With Shadow as his eyes and decades of tactical training at his disposal, this blind warrior will teach these criminals that true vision comes from the heart of a trained killer. The cartel is about to learn a brutal lesson about judging a veteran by his disability. Before we start this intense journey of vengeance and justice, buckle up, get ready and subscribe for a special surprise tomorrow. Dawn crept over Cedar Creek, painting the small town in shades of amber and gold. Marcus Stone's internal clock woke him at precisely 0500, a habit ingrained from 15 years of military service. He lay still for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of his bedroom. The soft whir of the ceiling fan, Shadow's steady breathing at the foot of his bed, and the distant rumble of early morning trucks on Main Street. Marcus swung his legs over the side of the bed, his bare feet finding the cold hardwood floor. Shadow's tail thumped against the floor, and Marcus felt the warm presence of his Belgian Malinois moving closer. The dog's cold nose pressed against his hand, their morning ritual beginning as it had every day for the past 3 years. "Ready for morning PT, boy?" Marcus asked, running his hand along Shadow's muscular frame. The dog's coat was still smooth, but Marcus could feel the slight ridge of scar tissue near his ribs, a permanent reminder of their last mission together. The memories flooded back as they did every morning. The mountains of Afghanistan, the pitch-black night, the intel about a high-value target in a compound near the Pakistan border. Shadow had caught the scent first, warning them about the IED hidden in the doorway. But there had been a second device, more sophisticated, waiting inside. Marcus pushed the memories away and stood, his movements precise and practiced. He didn't need sight to navigate his small ranch house. Every step was measured, every turn exact. Shadow stayed close, not because Marcus needed guidance at home, but because their bond had been forged in combat and strengthened by shared trauma. The morning routine was efficient, military precision applied to civilian life. Marcus, dressed in running shorts and a moisture-wicking shirt, his fingers identifying clothing by texture and location. He strapped on Shadow's special harness, the one that looked like a standard service dog vest to civilians, but contained multiple tactical attachments they both hoped they'd never need to use again. Outside, the morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine from the surrounding forests. Marcus took a moment to listen to his environment. Cedar Creek was still mostly asleep, but he could hear Mrs. Henderson, 3 houses down, watering her prized roses, the baker's delivery truck 2 blocks away, and the distant whistle of the 5:30 freight train. "Forward," Marcus commanded, and Shadow moved into position. They began their 5-mile run, a route they knew by heart. Shadow's harness was merely a formality in these moments. Marcus could run this course blindfolded even before losing his sight. Every crack in the sidewalk, every dip in the road, every corner was mapped in his mind with tactical precision. Their footfalls fell in sync, man and dog moving as one unit. To early risers who saw them pass, they were simply an inspiring sight. A disabled veteran and his faithful service dog. No one suspected that beneath Marcus's unseeing eyes lay the deadly skills of a force recon marine, or that Shadow's gentle demeanor masked a combat-trained military working dog. The run took them past the town's empty streets, through the park where Shadow had first alerted to unusual chemical smells last week, and around the warehouse district that had seen increasing traffic at odd hours. Marcus noted every detail. detail, storing them away with the methodical attention that had kept him alive in combat. They finished their run as the town Marcus could smell fresh bread from the diner, hear car doors slamming as the early shift headed to the factory, and feel the vibrations of heavy trucks moving through the industrial sector. Shadow guided them home, where Marcus immediately began his strength training routine. The garage had been converted into a home gym, every piece of equipment positioned precisely where Marcus could find it. He moved through his exercises with practiced efficiency, the weight of each rep carrying the burden of staying combat ready despite his disability. Shadow lay nearby, alert and watchful, even in the security of their home. Marcus's enhanced hearing picked up conversations from passing neighbors, catching fragments about missing teenagers and worried parents. There had been 3 overdoses in the past month, unusual for a town this size. Shadow's behavior had changed too, becoming more alert during their runs, especially near certain warehouses. After his workout, Marcus showered and dressed in his usual attire: jeans, a plain black t-shirt and comfortable boots. He ran his fingers over his watch, the raised markers telling him it was 700. Time for breakfast at May's Diner, their morning ritual for the past year. Before leaving, Marcus checked his hidden safe, confirming his backup pieces were secure. The town thought he'd left violence behind in Afghanistan, but experience had taught him that peace was often an illusion. His fingers traced the scars on his face, remembering the explosion that took his sight, but had somehow enhanced his other senses beyond normal human capacity. Shadow's harness jingled as Marcus attached his service dog Patches. The dog sat perfectly still, but Marcus could feel the coiled energy in him, the same readiness that had saved their lives countless times overseas. Together, they stepped out into the growing morning light, ready to face another day in Cedar Creek. Their walk to the diner was peaceful, but both man and dog remained alert. Marcus catalogued the subtle changes in his town: new voices, different traffic patterns, the increasing tension in casual conversations. His blindness had taught him to read a situation through sound, smell, and intuition. Right now, everything was telling him that Cedar Creek was changing, and not for the better. May's Diner sat on the corner of Main and Oak, its neon sign humming with electricity. The bell chimed as they entered, and the familiar scents of coffee, bacon, and maple syrup enveloped them. The usual morning crowd greeted them warmly, their voices carrying genuine affection for the quiet veteran and his loyal companion. Marcus settled into his regular booth, Shadow taking his position under the table. May herself brought their usual order: black coffee, 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, and a bowl of water for Shadow. She lingered longer than usual, her voice carrying a note of worry. "You be careful out there, Marcus," she said softly. "Things are different lately. Bad different." Marcus nodded, his unseeing eyes turned toward her voice. "Always am, May. Always am." As he ate his breakfast, Marcus listened to the diner's conversation, picking up threads of concern. Parents worried about their children, business owners discussing protection money, whispered fears about a new element in town. Shadow remained alert beneath the table, his body tense in a way that Marcus recognized from their combat days. The bell chimed again, and Shadow's muscles stiffened. Heavy boots crossed the threshold, accompanied by the smell of leather, motorcycle exhaust, and something else, something chemical that shouldn't be there. Marcus continued eating, but every sense was now focused on the newcomers, mapping their movements, counting their numbers, assessing the threat. Cedar Creek was changing, and Marcus Stone knew better than anyone that change often came with a price. He finished his coffee, paid his bill, and prepared to leave with Shadow. Whatever was coming, they would face it together, as they had every threat since that fateful day in Afghanistan. The only difference was that now the battlefield was home. Marcus stood from his booth, one hand on Shadow's harness, the other, leaving a generous tip for May. The bikers' presence filled the diner with tension, their leather vests creaking as they claimed the counter seats. The chemical smell grew stronger, and Shadow's muscles quivered beneath Marcus's fingertips. "Well, look what we got here," one of the bikers called out, his voice carrying the artificial confidence of someone trying to impress his peers. "A blind man and his mutt. This town really is going to the dogs." Marcus turned toward the voice, his face expressionless. The diner had gone quiet, the regular customers holding their breath. He could hear May's nervous footsteps in the kitchen, the slight tremor in her breathing. "Cute dog," another biker said, his boots scraping against the floor as he stood. "Wonder if he knows any tricks." But Marcus felt the slight change in his posture, a combat-ready stance disguised as casual alertness. Marcus. The dog's training was impeccable. Every hostile movement in the room catalogued and assessed without giving away his capabilities. "Just heading out," Marcus said calmly, taking a step toward the door. The bikers shifted and he mapped their positions by sound. 4 of them spread out along the counter, a 5th by the jukebox, trying to flank him. "What's your rush, hero?" The first voice again, closer now. "We're just being friendly, right, boys?" Laughter rippled through the group, but Marcus detected the underlying menace. These weren't ordinary troublemakers. Their movements were too coordinated, their positioning too tactical. The chemical smell grew stronger as one approached, confirming Shadow's earlier alert. "Your dog seems a bit tense," the nearest biker said. "Maybe he needs to learn some manners." Marcus heard the subtle sound of a knife being palmed. Amateur move, telegraphing the weapon. In Afghanistan, such mistakes got people killed. Shadow picked up on it too, a low growl building in his chest. "I wouldn't," Marcus said quietly. "He's a service dog. Interfering with him would be unwise." "Or what, blind man? You gonna do something about it?" The biker's breath carried traces of bourbon and something else, something pharmaceutical. Marcus adjusted his stance slightly, centering his weight. Shadow matched his movement, their years of training synchronizing automatically. "Last chance," Marcus warned. "Step aside." Instead, he felt the air shift as someone reached for Shadow's harness. Before their hand made contact, Marcus moved. His cane swept low, catching the biker's ankle. As the man stumbled, Marcus stepped past him, pulling Shadow clear of the group. "What the hell?" The biker regained his balance, anger replacing mockery. "You're dead, you blind piece of May's voice cut through the tension. "That's enough. I've called the sheriff. Either leave my diner or deal with him." The bikers hesitated. Marcus heard their leader weighing options, could practically feel the violence building in the air. Then the sound of sirens in the distance made the decision for them. "This ain't over," the leader spat. "Come on, boys. Food probably sucks here anyway." They filed out, Harleys roaring to life outside. Marcus remained still until the last motorcycle faded into the distance. Only then did he relax his stance, though Shadow remained alert. "Marcus, I'm so sorry," May said, approaching cautiously. "Those men, they've been causing trouble all over town lately. Nobody stands up to them." "It's all right, May." Marcus turned toward her voice. "But something's wrong with this picture. Those weren't ordinary bikers." "What do you mean?" Shadow picked up something on them. "Same chemicals he's been alerting to on our morning runs. Something's happening in Cedar Creek, May. Something bad." He could hear her wringing her hands, a nervous habit he'd noticed months ago. "The overdoses," she whispered. 3 kids in the past month. And now these men, throwing their weight around, demanding protection money. Marcus nodded. The pieces were falling into place. "Keep your doors locked at night, May, and call me if they come back." "But what can you—" She stopped herself. "Of course. Thank you, Marcus." Outside, Marcus paused to listen to the town. The bikers' arrival had changed something fundamental in Cedar Creek's rhythm. Fear had crept in, disrupting the natural flow of small-town life. Shadow pressed against his leg, sensing his tension. "Time to do some recon, boy," Marcus murmured, "just like old times." They walked home at their usual pace, maintaining their established routine. But Marcus's mind was already formulating plans, running scenarios. The bikers would be back, and next time they wouldn't be content with simple intimidation. At home, Marcus retrieved his laptop, the screen reader clicking as he accessed encrypted files from his military days. Shadow lay at his feet while he worked, occasionally lifting his head at passing sounds. The chemical traces Shadow detected matched compounds used in high-grade methamphetamine production. The bikers' movement suggested organized crime, not random troublemakers. Their tactical awareness, though sloppy, indicated some form of training. Marcus sent carefully worded emails to old contacts, seeking information about cartel activity in the region. Then he began mapping the town in his mind, marking potential surveillance points, escape routes, and choke points. The phone rang. Its specialized ringtone identifying the caller as James Chen, a former CIA analyst who owed Marcus his life. "Marcus," James said without preamble, "got your message. You're right to be concerned. Los Hierros cartel has been pushing into small towns across 3 states. They're using local gangs as cover, setting up distribution networks meant to soften up the territory. The real players stay hidden until the town's too scared to resist." Marcus absorbed this information, adding it to his mental map of the situation. Any DEA involvement? They're spread thin. Small towns are falling through the cracks. Marcus, be careful. These aren't Taliban fighters. They'll target civilians, families, anyone to maintain control. Understood. Thanks, James. After hanging up, Marcus sat in silence, planning his next move. Shadow's head lifted suddenly, ears tracking something outside. Moments later, Marcus heard it too. Motorcycles, moving slowly past their house. Surveillance, he said quietly. They're learning, Shadow. The bikes continued down the street, but Marcus knew they'd be back. The confrontation at the diner had escalated things. Now they'd try to learn his routines, probe for weaknesses. Marcus smiled grimly. Let them watch. They'd see exactly what he wanted them to see. A blind veteran and his service dog, nothing more. Meanwhile, he and Shadow would conduct their own reconnaissance, gathering intelligence and preparing for the storm they both knew was coming. He checked his weapons cache, verified his communications were secure, and began the methodical process of fortifying his home without appearing to do so. Years of combat experience had taught him to prepare for the worst while appearing to expect nothing. That night, Marcus lay awake, listening to Cedar Creek's changing rhythms. More vehicles in the warehouse district, different voices on the streets, the subtle signs of a town under siege. Shadow slept lightly beside the bed, his breathing steady but his muscles twitching occasionally, combat instincts never fully dormant. Together, they had survived worse situations, but this was different. This was home. Tomorrow, they would begin gathering evidence, building a case that law enforcement couldn't ignore. But for now, Marcus focused on the immediate threat. The bikers would return, probably with reinforcements, expecting an easy target. They would learn what others had discovered too late, that sometimes the most dangerous predator was the one they thought was prey. Marcus touched the scars around his eyes, remembering the lesson he'd learned in Afghanistan. True vision came from within, and his had never been clearer. The warehouse district loomed silent in the pre-dawn darkness as Marcus and Shadow conducted their covert reconnaissance. Their footsteps were ghost-like on the cracked concrete, every movement calculated to avoid detection. Shadow's nose worked constantly, tracking the chemical signatures that had become increasingly prevalent in Cedar Creek. Marcus kept one hand lightly on Shadow's harness, not for guidance, but for silent communication. His other hand held a modified cane, specially weighted and balanced for multiple purposes. His enhanced hearing picked up subtle movements from the warehouses, activity that shouldn't exist at this hour. Shadow froze, muscles tensing beneath Marcus's fingers. A moment later, Marcus heard it too, the soft scrape of boots on gravel, multiple sets moving with purpose. He guided them into the shadows between buildings, becoming part of the darkness. The footsteps drew closer. 3 men, Marcus calculated from their gait patterns. They spoke in hushed Spanish, discussing delivery schedules and payment issues. Shadow's tail twitched once, signaling the presence of the chemical traces they were tracking. The blind man could be a problem, one voice said, switching to English. Javier wants him dealt with. After the shipment, another replied. Focus on business first. Besides, how much trouble can a blind guy cause? Marcus allowed himself a small smile as the men passed their hiding spot. Their operational security was amateur at best. In Afghanistan, such carelessness got people killed. He memorized their voices, mapping them to the mental file he was building. Once the men were gone, Marcus and Shadow continued their reconnaissance. The dog led them to a specific warehouse, its metal walls vibrating with the hum of industrial equipment. The chemical smell was strongest here, mixing with the sharp tang of industrial cleaner, a common cartel tactic for masking drug production. Marcus documented the location mentally, adding it to his growing map of cartel operations. 3 warehouses showing suspicious activity, 5 new vehicles with out-of-state plates, 7 unfamiliar voices with distinct patterns of movement. The picture was becoming clearer, and it wasn't good. A sudden burst of activity from the main street caught his attention. Police sirens, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of paramedics. Shadow shifted uneasily, picking up on his handler's tension. They made their way toward the commotion, maintaining their cover as a blind veteran taking an early morning walk. The crowd's whispers told the story before they reached the scene. A teenager this time, found behind the old movie theater. It's getting worse, a woman's voice said nearby. Marcus recognized Mrs. Henderson, his neighbor. These new people in town, the way things are changing. Someone needs to do something. Marcus listened to the police radio chatter from a nearby cruiser. They were already calling it an accidental overdose, case closed. No mention of investigation, no questions about the source. The corruption ran deeper than he'd suspected. Shadow guided them home as the sun began to rise, their reconnaissance complete for now. Marcus spent the morning compiling his intelligence, using his specialized computer setup to create encrypted files. The cartel operation was larger than he'd initially thought, suggesting this was more than just a distribution hub. His phone rang, the unique tone identifying Detective Sarah Martinez, one of the few clean cops he'd identified in Cedar Creek. "Marcus," she said, her voice tight with concern. "Got a minute? Always for you, Detective. The overdose? How? Did you know what? Never mind. Yes. Thing is, this kid was different. Honor student, athlete, no history of drug use. And the toxicology is weird. This stuff is pure professional grade, way beyond local dealer quality." Marcus absorbed this information. "The warehouse district is busy at night." A pause. "You've been investigating." "Just walking my dog, Detective. He has a sensitive nose." Sarah sighed. "Be careful, Marcus. These people, they're not just dealers. We've got 3 missing persons cases in the past month. Nobody's connecting the dots yet, but the dots form a pretty clear picture." Marcus finished. "You be careful too, Detective. Watch your back." After hanging up, Marcus retrieved his cache of surveillance equipment. Tools he'd hoped never to use again, but had kept maintained out of hard-learned caution. Shadow watched as he checked each piece, their old mission routine falling naturally into place. The afternoon brought more intelligence. May called from the diner, her voice shaking slightly. The bikers had returned, this time with suits, men speaking in careful tones about business opportunities and protection services. They'd left their cards, Los Hierros Imports. Marcus added this to his growing file. The cartel was moving fast, establishing legitimate covers while their drug operation ramped up. They were following a familiar playbook, one he'd seen in other towns during his military intelligence days. Shadow's head snapped up suddenly, tracking movement outside. Marcus heard it a moment later, motorcycles moving slowly past the house again. Different riders this time, their engines tuned for stealth rather than intimidation. Professional surveillance. "They're escalating, boy," Marcus murmured, scratching Shadow behind the ears. "Time we did too." That evening, they made their way to the local veterans meeting at the community center. Marcus listened carefully to the conversations around him, gathering more pieces of the puzzle. Other vets had noticed changes too. Missing shipments from the trucking company, strange activities at the rail yard, new faces asking questions about security systems and patrol routes. After the meeting, Marcus walked home with Bill Henderson, a former Army Ranger who worked security at the rail yard. "They offered to triple my salary," Bill said quietly, "just to look the other way certain nights. When I refused, they mentioned my granddaughter by name, knew which school she attended." Marcus's grip tightened on Shadow's harness. "The police? Half of them are bought, the other half are scared. This goes deep, Marcus, higher up than just local dealers." "I know someone in the DEA," Marcus offered. "Might be able to get some attention on this. Be careful who you trust. These people, they've got eyes everywhere now." Marcus nodded, already formulating plans. The cartel was following their standard infiltration strategy, but they'd made a crucial mistake. They'd assumed Cedar Creek was defenseless, just another small town to be swallowed up by their operation. They hadn't counted on facing someone who'd spent years hunting similar organizations in the most dangerous places on Earth. Someone who'd learned to turn darkness into an advantage, who could read a battlefield through sound and instinct alone. Shadow pressed against his leg, combat ready even in his service dog vest. They had work to do, intelligence to gather, weaknesses to probe. The cartel thought they were dealing with a helpless blind veteran. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Marcus sat in his darkened living room, listening to the recordings from the surveillance devices he'd planted throughout the warehouse district. Shadow lay at his feet, ears twitching at each new voice captured in the audio. 3 days of constant monitoring had yielded valuable intelligence about the cartel's operation. Their production facility processing raw materials shipped in through the rail yard. Bill Henderson's refusal to cooperate had forced them to use alternate routes, creating a vulnerability in their supply chain. The bikers provided security, but their patterns were predictable, their rotations sloppy. A familiar voice emerged from the recordings. Police Chief Morgan discussing shipment schedules with someone Marcus had identified as a cartel lieutenant. The corruption ran through the entire department, with only a handful of clean officers like Detective Martinez remaining. Shadow's head lifted suddenly, tracking movement outside. Marcus switched off the recordings, focusing his enhanced hearing on the street. 2 vehicles moving slowly past the house, different from the bikers' usual surveillance. These engines were nearly silent, high-end SUVs running at low speed. Professional hitters, Marcus murmured to Shadow. They're bringing in specialists. He activated the perimeter sensors he'd installed, marking the vehicle's positions. The SUVs circled the block twice before parking 2 streets over. 4 men emerged, their footsteps indicating tactical training. They moved like soldiers, not street thugs. Marcus's phone vibrated. Detective Martinez's tone. They just found another body, she said without preamble. Jenny Mills, 17, same high-grade product as the others, but this time there are signs of struggle. Marcus absorbed this information. Not an overdose. Murder made to look like one. Marcus, these people, they're sending a message. Jenny's father works for the rail yard security company with Bill Henderson. Yes, this is escalating fast. I'm trying to get the FBI involved, but there's resistance from above. Chief Morgan's blocking everything. Marcus heard the fear in her voice. Stay safe, detective. Document everything, but don't draw attention. After hanging up, Marcus returned to his intelligence gathering. Shadow's keen nose had identified 3 distinct chemical signatures in the warehouse district. 2 matched known drug manufacturing processes, but the third was unusual, something new, possibly explaining the high purity levels in the overdose cases. The sound of breaking glass echoed from several blocks away, followed by angry voices. Marcus recognized the location, May's Diner. The bikers were making another show of force, reminding the town who was in charge now. Time to move, Shadow. They slipped out through the back door, using the network of alleyways Marcus had mapped in his mind. The diner's neon sign hummed ahead, partially obscured by 5 motorcycles parked haphazardly out front. Marcus counted 8 distinct voices inside, smell of leather and engine oil mixing with May's evening coffee. Please, I can't afford any. More protection money, May's voice carried through the broken window. You're killing my business. That's the point, lady, a biker laughed. Either you pay, or something worse than a window gets broken. Marcus positioned himself near the side door, Shadow alert at his side. The bikers were focused on May, unaware of their surroundings. Sloppy, amateur. Their arrogance made them vulnerable. He triggered the fire alarm he'd previously modified in the building next door. The sudden noise drew the bikers' attention, creating a moment of confusion. Marcus moved quickly, entering through the side door while Shadow circled to the front. What the hell was that? One biker demanded, moving toward the window. Marcus let his cane tap against the floor, playing his role. May, is everything all right? I heard glass breaking. The bikers spun toward him, their surprise evident in their sharp intakes of breath. Marcus mapped their positions by sound, noting their movements, identifying the leaders from the followers. Well, if it ain't the blind hero, the lead biker sneered. This ain't your business, friend. Walk away while you can still walk. Marcus kept his face neutral, his unseeing eyes aimed slightly above their heads. Actually, it is my business. May makes the best coffee in town. I'd hate to see anything happen to her establishment. That a threat, blind man? Just an observation. Like how your friend by the counter is about to reach for the weapon in his jacket. Or how there's a police cruiser turning onto Main Street right now. The bikers tensed, thrown off by his accuracy. The sound of sirens grew closer, and Marcus allowed himself a small smile. Detective Martinez's timing was perfect. This ain't over, the leader spat. Not by a long shot. They retreated quickly, engines roaring as they disappeared into the night. Marcus waited until they were gone before turning to May. Are you all right? Yes, but Marcus, you shouldn't have. They'll come back. Maybe worse next time. Let them. He pulled out his phone. Detective Martinez will want to take your statement. This time we're documenting everything. Later that night, while Shadow kept watch, the cartel was following a familiar pattern of escalation, but they were moving faster than usual. Something was driving their timeline, forcing them to take risks. His phone buzzed with an encrypted message from his DEA contact. Surveillance photos showed increased activity at the border, suggesting a major operation in motion. The Cedar Creek operation was part of something bigger. Shadow's ears perked up at a sound from outside. Marcus focused his hearing, identifying the now familiar engine sounds of the professional surveillance team. They were maintaining their distance, studying his routines, looking for weaknesses. Let them watch, he thought. Every minute they spent watching him was a minute he spent learning their patterns, understanding their organization, mapping their vulnerabilities. In Afghanistan, he'd learned that patience was often the deadliest weapon. The cartel thought they were hunting him. They didn't realize realized that Shadow's keen nose was tracking their movements, that Marcus's enhanced hearing was cataloging their conversations, that every act of intimidation revealed more about their operation. Soon they would learn what others had discovered too late, that sometimes the most dangerous predator was the one they thought was helpless. Marcus reached down to scratch Shadow behind the ears, feeling the combat-ready tension in the dog's muscles. They had more reconnaissance to conduct, more intelligence to gather. The cartel was planning something big, and time was running out to stop them. The cartel's retaliation came swiftly and brutally. Marcus stood in May's diner, his enhanced hearing picking up the cacophony of destruction. Glass crunched beneath his boots, mixed with the splintered remains of tables and chairs. The air reeked of gasoline and smoke. They came in the middle of the night. May's voice shook as she surveyed the damage. Destroyed everything. The insurance won't cover this. They made sure everyone knows they were behind it. Shadow pressed against Marcus's leg, alerting him to approaching footsteps. Detective Martinez's familiar stride echoed through the ruined diner. Just got the security footage, she said. 6 men, professional job. They disabled the cameras first, but not before we got partial faces, running them through the database. Now, Marcus nodded, his mind already mapping out the next moves. The cartel was escalating, showing the town what happened to those who resisted. But they'd made a critical error. Professional criminals didn't let emotion drive their actions. This attack was personal, which meant they were vulnerable. They hit 3 other businesses last night, Martinez continued. Bill Henderson's garage, the pharmacy on 5th, and the community center. They're sending a message. Marcus's phone vibrated with an encrypted message from his DEA contact. The border activity had intensified. Whatever operation the cartel was planning, it was accelerating. May, I need you to close the diner for a few days, Marcus said. Take some time away from town. I can't just leave, she protested. This place is all I have. Trust me. Marcus's voice carried the weight of combat experience. Things are about to get worse before they get better. Shadow's muscles tensed suddenly, tracking movement outside. Marcus heard the distinctive rumble of motorcycle engines, different from the usual bikers. These were higher-end machines, professionally maintained. Company, he murmured. Detective, get May to the back. The motorcycles stopped outside, engines idling. 3 riders dismounted, their footsteps indicating tactical training. These weren't ordinary bikers. They moved like soldiers. The bell above the door chimed as they entered. Marcus stood his ground, Shadow alert beside him. He mapped their positions by sound, noting their practiced spacing and controlled movements. Mr. Stone, one man spoke, his voice carrying a hint of South American accent. My employer wishes to discuss the misunderstanding from last night. Misunderstanding? Marcus kept his tone neutral. Destroying a woman's business seems pretty clear to me. Unfortunate events occur when people make poor choices. My employer prefers cooperation to conflict. He's willing to be generous. Marcus heard the subtle shift of fabric as one man moved to flank him. Shadow's low growl warned the man to keep his distance. Tell your employer that Cedar Creek isn't for sale, the lead man sighed. You misunderstand, Mr. Stone. This isn't a negotiation. This is a courtesy. A blind man should know when to stay out of matters that don't concern him. A blind man sees more than you think, Marcus replied. Like the fact that your friend on the left is carrying a suppressed pistol, or that you have a knife in your boot. The men tensed, thrown off balance by his accuracy. Marcus used their momentary confusion to step forward, his cane tapping. Tell your employer that his operation has been compromised. Every shipment, every route, every corrupt cop on his payroll. The DEA has it all. You're bluffing, the leader said, but uncertainty crept into his voice. I'd ask him about the missing product from last week's shipment, or the surveillance photos from the border crossing. The men exchanged glances, their confidence shaken. Marcus had gambled, using bits of intelligence to imply deeper knowledge. It was a tactic that had served him well in Afghanistan. This is your last warning, the leader said, but the threat in his voice had diminished. Stay out of our business. They retreated, motorcycles roaring away. Marcus waited until they were gone before allowing his stance to relax. That was either very brave or very stupid, Detective Martinez said, emerging from the back with May. Maybe both, Marcus admitted. But now we know something important. They're scared. Shadow's nose worked the air where the men had stood, confirming Marcus's suspicion. The same chemical traces from the warehouse district had clung to their clothes. These weren't just messengers. They were directly involved in production. I'll have uniforms watch the diner, Martinez offered. Though after last night, I'm not sure who I can trust. Trust no one. Marcus advised. Document everything. Build your case. When this breaks, it needs to be airtight. After Martinez left, Marcus helped May salvage what she could from the diner. His enhanced hearing picked up whispered conversations from passers-by, the town's fear mixing with growing anger. The cartel had overplayed their hand, turning public sentiment against them. That evening, Marcus reviewed his intelligence while Shadow kept watch. The cartel's operation was larger than anyone suspected, using Cedar Creek as a major distribution hub. But their aggressive timeline suggested pressure from somewhere. They were rushing, making mistakes. His phone buzzed with a message from Bill Henderson. The rail yard security footage showed unusual activity, multiple shipping containers being moved under cover of darkness. Something big was coming. Shadow's ears perked up at a sound from outside. Marcus focused his hearing, identifying the now familiar engine sounds of the professional surveillance team. They were watching him more closely now, assessing the threat he posed. Let them watch, he thought. Every minute they spent watching him was a minute he spent learning their patterns, understanding their organization, mapping their vulnerabilities. The cartel thought they were dealing with a helpless, blind veteran. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Marcus reached down to scratch Shadow behind the ears, feeling the combat-ready tension in the dog's muscles. The cartel had shown their hand today, revealing weaknesses in their professional facade. Now it was time to exploit those weaknesses, to turn their own tactics against them. The real war for Cedar Creek was about to begin. The attempt on Marcus's life came at precisely 0300, just as his military training had taught him to expect. Shadow's subtle shift in breathing woke him seconds before the first suppressed shot shattered his bedroom window. Marcus rolled smoothly off the bed, muscle memory from countless combat situations taking over. 3 distinct firing positions, he calculated from the sound. Professional shooters using subsonic ammunition. They'd waited for the exact moment, when most people would be in their deepest sleep. But Marcus wasn't most people, and this wasn't their first assassination attempt. Shadow moved silently to his assigned position, years of combat training evident in every motion. Marcus retrieved his go-bag from beneath the bed, accessing his encrypted phone as glass continued to rain down around him. Detective Martinez, execution team at my house. 3 shooters, possibly more in support. Civilian casualties likely if this continues. He disconnected before she could respond, knowing she'd understand the implications. The cartel had escalated to deadly force, abandoning any pretense of legitimate business. Marcus identified the shooters' positions by sound. One in the oak tree across the street, another on the neighbor's roof, the third in a vehicle at the corner. Their crossfire was perfect, covering every conventional escape route. But Marcus had prepared for this. A fresh volley of shots traced his previous position. These weren't random thugs with guns. Their fire discipline and positioning spoke of military or specialized law enforcement training. The cartel was using their best assets. Shadow's low growl warned of movement at the back of the house. Marcus heard the soft scrape of a lockpick, followed by the careful steps of an entry team. 4 men moving with tactical precision. Time to disappoint them, boy, Marcus whispered. He triggered the first of several prepared countermeasures, blowing out the carefully placed surveillance cameras the cartel had installed days earlier. In the same instant, Shadow activated a sequence of recorded sounds throughout the house, creating the illusion of movement. The entry team split up, exactly as Marcus had anticipated. Their training would compel them to clear the house systematically, dividing their strength. He could hear them checking rooms, their movements betraying their growing confusion at finding each one empty. Marcus moved silently through the hidden passage he'd built into the walls, a skill honed during countless night operations in Afghanistan. Shadow followed, his paws making no sound on the reinforced panels. The first team member died silently, never knowing what hit him. Marcus's enhanced hearing had mapped the man's position perfectly, allowing him to strike through a concealed panel with lethal precision. The second fell moments later, Shadow's attack as swift as it was silent. Outside, the shooters maintained their firing positions, unaware that their targets had shifted the battlefield. Marcus accessed his phone again, sending a predetermined signal. Across town, Detective Martinez would be mobilized keeping the few clean. Officers she trusted, moving on locations Marcus had identified during weeks of surveillance. The remaining team members realized something was wrong, their movements becoming more urgent. Marcus heard them regroup in the living room, switching to rapid Spanish as they reported the disappearance of their colleagues. A sudden burst of sirens in the distance caused the shooters to abandon their positions. Marcus tracked their withdrawal by sound, noting their escape routes and rally points. The cartel's playbook was becoming clearer with each operation. Detective Martinez responding to shots fired. Her voice crackled over the police band. All units be advised. Multiple suspects. You're fleeing north on Cedar Street. Marcus allowed himself a grim smile. The cartel's attempt to eliminate him had failed, and in doing so, they'd exposed their professional assets. Now he knew exactly what kind of operators he was dealing with. His phone vibrated with an encrypted message from his DEA contact. The surveillance photos from the border showed increased activity, suggesting the cartel was moving up their timeline. The attack on Marcus wasn't just about silencing a threat, it was about clearing obstacles for something bigger. Shadow's ears tracked movement outside as police vehicles converged on the scene. Marcus heard Detective Martinez coordinating the response, ensuring only trusted officers secured the area. The two bodies in his house would raise questions, but he'd prepared for that contingency. "Marcus," Martinez called from outside. "Are you all right?" "Clear to enter," he responded. Two suspects down inside. The rest escaped north. Martinez entered cautiously, her sharp intake of breath telling him she'd found the bodies. "Professional hardware," she observed. "Military-grade weapons and tactical gear. This is way beyond local muscle." "They're escalating," Marcus confirmed. "The cartel's moving something big through Cedar Creek, something worth sending their best teams to clear the way." "The FBI's finally paying attention," Martinez said. "After tonight, they can't ignore this anymore." Marcus nodded, but he knew federal intervention would take time they didn't have. The cartel was operating on an accelerated timeline, taking risks they'd normally avoid. Whatever they were planning, it was happening soon. Shadow pressed against his leg, combat tension still evident in the dog's muscles. They'd survived the cartel's first serious attempt to eliminate them, but it wouldn't be the last. The real war for Cedar Creek was just beginning. His enhanced hearing picked up familiar engine sounds in the distance. The surveillance team was back, watching the police response, assessing the failure of their operation. Marcus let them watch, knowing that every move they made revealed more about their organization. The cartel had shown their hand tonight, demonstrating both their capabilities and their desperation. Now it was time to make them pay for that mistake. Marcus reached down to scratch Shadow behind the ears, feeling the same lethal focus in his companion that had kept them alive through countless missions. They had work to do. The cartel had brought war to Cedar Creek. It was time to show them exactly who they were fighting. Marcus moved through the warehouse district like a ghost, Shadow at his side, their movements synchronized by years of combat operations. The night air carried the chemical signatures Shadow had been tracking, stronger now as they approached. Their target, the cartel's main production facility, operated behind the facade of a legitimate shipping company, its security designed to look ordinary while hiding a professional military presence. Two guards patrolled the perimeter. Marcus mapped their patrol pattern by sound, identifying the gaps in their coverage. Shadow's subtle muscle tensions telegraphed the position of surveillance cameras and motion sensors. Marcus activated his encrypted phone, confirming that Detective Martinez had her trusted officers in position. The DEA task force was standing by as well, though they remained unaware that their critical intelligence had come from a blind veteran and his service dog. The guards passed their position, and Marcus moved. Years of operating without sight had honed his other senses to superhuman levels. He could hear the subtle electronic hum of security systems, feel the vibrations of machinery through the concrete, sense the changes in air pressure that indicated open spaces versus walls. Shadow guided them through the blind spots in the security coverage, his military training evident in every silent step. They reached the building's maintenance entrance undetected. Marcus retrieved the security codes he'd obtained by recording the electronic tones of guards' keypad entries days earlier. Inside, the facility's true nature became evident. Shadow's nose tracked the chemical processes of large-scale drug production, while Marcus's hearing picked up conversations in Spanish about shipment schedules and processing quotas. They moved to the facility's nerve center, where Marcus planted planted the first of several devices, modified surveillance equipment that would transmit detailed intelligence directly to the DEA. Shadow kept watch, his combat training allowing him to remain perfectly still while alert to any threat. A guard approached their position, his footsteps indicating he was armed with a submachine gun. Marcus and Shadow withdrew into the shadows, their presence undetected. The guard passed within inches of them, never knowing how close he'd come to death. Marcus planted the remaining devices according to his carefully memorized plan. Each one would provide crucial evidence of the cartel's operation, enough to justify a full federal response. But the intelligence gathering was only part of their mission. Shadow's muscles tensed suddenly, alerting Marcus to approaching vehicles, heavy trucks, moving with purpose. The shipment they'd been waiting for was arriving early. Marcus accessed his phone, sending a predetermined signal to Detective Martinez. The cartel was about to reveal the full scope of their operation, and every moment would be recorded. The facility burst into activity as the trucks arrived. Marcus and Shadow maintained their hidden position, gathering intelligence as workers began unloading crates. The chemical signatures changed, indicating something new, something more dangerous than their usual product. Marcus recorded everything, his enhanced hearing picking up conversations about distribution networks and processing schedules. The cartel's entire operation was exposing itself, unaware that their security had been compromised. Shadow's subtle warning gave them time to avoid the additional guards who arrived to supervise the shipment. These men moved differently, their training evident in every step. Cartel specialists, brought in to ensure nothing went wrong, they worked their way back toward their exit point, gathering final pieces of intelligence. The cartel's operation was larger than anyone had suspected, using Cedar Creek as a major distribution hub for something new and lethal. Outside, Marcus heard the surveillance team that had been watching his house. They were monitoring the facility's perimeter, still hunting for the blind veteran who had survived their assassination attempt. He allowed himself a grim smile, knowing they'd never suspect he was inside their operation. Shadow guided them clear of the facility, their exit as ghost-like as their entry. Behind them, the cartel's operation continued, unaware that they'd just provided federal authorities with everything needed to shut them down. Marcus and Shadow made their way home through pre-dawn darkness, their mission complete. The intelligence they'd gathered would take time to process, but the DEA would soon have what they needed. The cartel's days in Cedar Creek were numbered. His phone vibrated with a message from Detective Martinez. The FBI had finally approved a task force based on the mounting evidence of cartel activity. Federal resources were being mobilized, though they remained unaware of the intelligence operation that had made it possible. Shadow's ears tracked movement nearby. The surveillance team was still watching Marcus's house, monitoring his routine. Let them watch, he thought. Their focus on him had allowed him to infiltrate their core operation. The cartel thought they were hunting a blind veteran. They didn't realize that every moment they spent watching him was another moment he spent dismantling their organization. Their own security protocols had become their greatest vulnerability. Scratch Shadow behind the ears, feeling the same lethal focus in his companion that had kept them alive through countless missions. The cartel had brought their operation to Cedar Creek, threatening everything Marcus had fought to protect. Now they would learn what others had discovered too late. Sometimes the most dangerous predator was the one they thought was prey. Dawn approached as Marcus and Shadow returned home, maintaining their normal routine. The cartel's surveillance team noted his arrival, unaware that their target had just spent the night gathering the intelligence that would destroy their organization. They had one more mission to complete. The evidence was in place. The authorities were mobilizing, but the cartel's operation was still active. Before federal forces could move in, Marcus and Shadow had to ensure the cartel couldn't destroy evidence or harm innocent civilians. The real battle for Cedar Creek was about to begin, and Marcus intended to finish what the cartel had started. They'd chosen this town as their battleground, never suspecting that it was defended by a warrior who had mastered the art of fighting in darkness. The escalation came faster than Marcus anticipated. Shadow's warning growl alerted him to approaching vehicles, multiple SUVs moving with tactical precision through the pre-dawn darkness. The cartel's professional hit squad had returned in force. Marcus counted the vehicles by size sound. 6 SUVs, each carrying a full tactical team. The cartel had abandoned subtlety, bringing enough firepower to level a city block. They were done playing games with the blind veteran who had survived their first assassination attempt. His encrypted phone vibrated with an urgent message from Detective Martinez. The FBI task force was still 24 hours away from deployment. Local law enforcement was compromised. No help would come from official channels. Shadow pressed against Marcus's leg, combat tension radiating through the dog's muscles. They had prepared for this scenario, but the cartel's timing was perfect. Most of Cedar Creek's residents would be asleep, potential witnesses safely out of the way. The SUVs deployed their teams with military precision. Marcus mapped their movements by sound, recognizing the tactics of professional operators. These weren't ordinary cartel soldiers. They were specialists brought in to ensure total mission success. Marcus activated his prepared defenses as the first team approached his house. The neighborhood's power grid failed, plunging the area into darkness. The hit squad's night vision equipment would work against them now, creating light. Blooms from the infrared strobes Marcus had hidden throughout the area. Shadow moved silently to his assigned position as Marcus heard the first team stack up on his front door. Their communications were silent, using hand signals and tactical gestures. Professional but predictable, the breach came simultaneously from multiple entry points. Marcus had expected this, using their own tactics against them. The first team encountered a series of non-lethal traps that forced them to bunch up in the kill box Marcus had prepared. Shadow's attack came without warning. The dog's combat training made him lethal in darkness, targeting the team's rear security element. Their disciplined silence broke as Shadow's attack created chaos in their formation. Marcus moved through his house like a ghost, using paths he had memorized through thousands of repetitions. The hit squad's training worked against them, their methodical room clearing, putting them exactly where Marcus wanted them. The second team attempted to provide support through the windows, but Marcus's enhanced hearing allowed him to track their movements perfectly. Each shot found its target, his accuracy honed by years of operating without sight. Shadow's growl warned of the third team approaching from the rear. Marcus triggered another set of defenses, filling the area with smoke containing the same chemical. Traces they used to mask their drug production. Their own tactics turned against them. The hit squad's communication broke down as confusion spread through their ranks. These men were used to being the predators, not the prey. Their training hadn't prepared them for an opponent who turned darkness into a weapon. Marcus moved constantly, never staying in one position long enough to be targeted. His hearing tracked every movement, every whispered command, every attempt to reorganize their assault. The hit squad was learning too late that they had severely underestimated their target. Shadow's next attack targeted their command element, the dog's military training evident in his selection of targets. Without leadership, the remaining teams began to lose coordination. Their precision devolved into chaos. Marcus's phone vibrated again. Detective Martinez had mobilized her trusted officers, establishing a perimeter to contain the situation, had provided the perfect opportunity to identify their compromised law enforcement assets. The hit squad began to withdraw, their professional discipline shattered by an enemy they couldn't effectively target. Marcus allowed them to retreat, knowing that their failure would force the cartel to accelerate their timeline. Shadow returned to Marcus's side as the last SUV fled into the darkness. They had survived the cartel's best attempt to eliminate them, but the real battle was just beginning. The cartel would be desperate now, their carefully planned operation thrown into chaos. Marcus reached down to scratch Shadow behind the ears, feeling the combat tension still radiating through the dog's muscles. They had won this engagement, but the cartel wouldn't stop. Their entire operation in Cedar Creek was at risk. His phone indicated multiple messages from his DEA contact. The task force deployment had been accelerated based on the night's events. Federal resources were finally mobilizing, but Marcus knew they wouldn't arrive in time to prevent the cartel's desperate countermoves. Shadow's ears tracked movement outside as Detective Martinez arrived to secure the scene. The cartel's surveillance team would be watching, assessing the failure of their operation. Marcus let them watch, knowing that every move they made revealed more about their organization. The time for subtle infiltration and intelligence gathering was over. The cartel had brought their full force to bear and failed. Now they would be forced to protect their operation while dealing with a threat they couldn't effectively target. Marcus and Shadow had survived survived their most dangerous encounter yet, but the war for Cedar Creek was far from over. The cartel's desperation would make them more dangerous than ever. The real battle was about to begin. The cartel's desperation manifested in the worst possible way. Marcus heard the commotion at May's Diner from 3 blocks away, his enhanced hearing picking up the sounds of struggle and terrified voices. Shadow's muscles tensed as they approached, the dog's combat instincts responding to the situation. Through the diner's broken windows, Marcus could hear May and several customers being held at gunpoint. The cartel had taken hostages, their professional hit squad's failure driving them to more brutal tactics. "Final warning, Mr. Stone," a familiar voice called out, the cartel lieutenant from their previous encounter. "Surrender yourself, or these people die." Marcus counted heartbeats and breathing patterns by sound. 8 hostages, including May, 4 cartel gunmen inside, with more watching the perimeter. They had chosen the diner carefully, knowing its emotional significance to the town. Shadow pressed against Marcus's leg, awaiting commands. They had trained for hostage situations in Afghanistan, but this was different. These weren't Taliban fighters. These were professional criminals with nothing left to lose. "You have 30 seconds, the lieutenant called, "or we start with the old woman who makes your coffee every morning." Marcus heard May's defiant struggle, followed by the sharp sound of a hand striking flesh. The cartel had made their first mistake. They had hurt someone under his protection. His phone vibrated with messages from Detective Martinez. Her trusted officers were establishing a perimeter, but they couldn't move in without risking the hostages. The FBI task force was still hours away. 20 seconds, Mr. Stone. Marcus activated his encrypted phone, sending a predetermined signal. Throughout Cedar Creek, evidence of the cartel's operation began uploading to federal servers. Their entire network exposed, their protection compromised. 10 seconds. Shadow moved silently to his position as Marcus took 1 step forward. "Release the hostages, and I'll consider letting you survive this." Laughter echoed from the diner. "The blind man threatens us. Perhaps we should kill 1 hostage now to show we're serious." Marcus heard the subtle shift of weapons being raised, the change in breathing patterns as gunmen prepared to fire. His mental map of the diner was perfect, every table and counter memorized through countless visits. "Last chance," Marcus warned. "Surrender now." The lieutenant's response was cut short as Marcus triggered his prepared countermeasures. The diner's power failed, plunging the interior into darkness. Simultaneously, Shadow launched his attack through the broken window, targeting the nearest gunman with lethal precision. Marcus moved like a ghost, entering through the side door. As chaos erupted inside, the cartel soldiers fired blindly, their shots going wide as Marcus navigated the familiar space with perfect accuracy. The first gunman fell to Marcus's strike, never seeing the attack coming. The second died trying to use a hostage as shield, not realizing that Marcus could distinguish friend from foe by heartbeat alone. Of the third gunman, as the dog drove him away from the hostages, Marcus intercepted the man's retreat, his enhanced hearing allowing him to strike with deadly precision. The lieutenant attempted to restore order, shouting commands. In Spanish, Marcus tracked him by sound, moving through the darkness like it was bright day. The cartel soldiers' training meant nothing against an opponent who had mastered fighting without sight. Outside, Detective Martinez coordinated her response team, containing the situation while Marcus dealt with the immediate threat. The cartel's perimeter team attempted to provide support, but darkness and confusion made them ineffective. Marcus reached the lieutenant as the man prepared to execute May. The cartel soldier's last mistake was assuming his target's blindness was a weakness. Marcus's strike ended the threat permanently. Shadow herded the hostages to safety as Marcus secured the diner. The cartel's attempt to force his surrender had failed spectacularly, their professional soldiers eliminated by a blind veteran and his service dog. Detective Martinez entered once the scene was secure. "FBI's been updated. This incident just accelerated their timeline." Marcus nodded, his enhanced hearing tracking the withdrawal of surviving cartel forces. "They'll destroy evidence, try to evacuate their operation. My clean officers are monitoring all exit routes." Martinez assured him. "They're trapped in Cedar Creek." Shadow returned to Marcus's side, combat tension still evident in the dog's muscles. The cartel's failed hostage gambit marked a turning point. They were no longer fighting to expand their operation. Now, they were fighting to survive. Marcus reached down to scratch Shadow behind the ears, feeling the same lethal focus that had kept them alive through countless missions. The cartel had brought violence to his town, threatened his people. Their desperation had led them to cross a line from which there was no return. His phone vibrated with updates from his DEA contact. Federal forces were mobilizing faster now, the hostage situation providing the urgency they needed. But Marcus knew the cartel wouldn't wait for official intervention. They would make one final push to salvage their operation, evacuate their assets, eliminate evidence. Their professional soldiers had failed, but they still had local muscle and corrupted law enforcement to draw upon. The war for Cedar Creek had entered its final phase. The cartel had shown their desperation, and Marcus had demonstrated his capabilities. Now both sides would commit everything to the coming battle. Shadow's ears tracked movement outside as cartel forces regrouped. In the distance, let them come, Marcus thought. They had brought war to his town, threatened his people. Now they would learn why even their best soldiers feared fighting in darkness. The cartel's facility burst into frantic activity as Marcus and Shadow approached. Through the darkness, his enhanced hearing picked up the sounds of evidence destruction, vehicles being loaded, and urgent commands being shouted in Spanish. The failed hostage situation had forced them to accelerate their evacuation. Shadow guided them through gaps in the perimeter security, the dog's military training, allowing them to exploit blind spots in the cartel's defensive positions. Marcus counted heartbeats and breathing patterns, mapping the distribution of forces by sound alone. His encrypted phone vibrated with updates from Detective Martinez. Her clean officers had established containment positions, while the FBI task force was inbound with full tactical support, but they were still hours away. The cartel would be gone before federal forces arrived. Marcus identified multiple security elements by their movement patterns, local muscle mixed with the remaining professional operators, their different training levels evident in their patrol discipline. The cartel was throwing everything they had into protecting their evacuation. Shadow's muscles tensed as they reached their first objective. The facility's power distribution center housed backup generators that kept their security systems operating. Marcus planted explosive charges with practiced efficiency, each device placed precisely where it would do maximum damage. They moved deeper into the facility, Shadow's nose tracking the chemical signatures of drug production, while Marcus mapped enemy positions by sound. The cartel's evacuation was organized but hurried, their priority shifting from protecting assets to destroying evidence. Marcus activated his prepared infiltration route, moving through maintenance passages and ventilation systems he had memorized during previous reconnaissance. Each step was calculated, every movement designed to avoid detection until the perfect moment. His enhanced hearing picked up conversations about destination points, evacuation routes, contingency plans, the cartel's entire operational structure as they rushed to salvage what they could. Shadow alerted to approaching guards, allowing them to avoid detection. These weren't the professional operators they had fought earlier. These were local thugs, their undisciplined movements making them easy to evade. They reached the facility's main production area as workers rushed to clear equipment and destroy records. Marcus planted additional charges at key structural points, each explosion carefully calculated to create maximum disruption with minimal risk to surrounding buildings. His phone delivered final confirmation from Detective Martinez. All escape routes were covered. The FBI task force was 90 minutes out. The cartel's time was running out. Shadow's warning growl alerted Marcus to familiar footsteps. The cartel lieutenant who had led the hostage situation had survived, now coordinating the evacuation with desperate efficiency. His movements betrayed combat injuries from their previous encounter. Marcus synchronized his watch with the planted explosives. Timing would be critical. The charges needed to detonate in sequence, herding the cartel forces into prepared containment zones while preventing their evidence destruction. They completed their final preparations as the evacuation reached its peak. Vehicle engines rumbled throughout the facility, heavily armed escorts preparing to protect their shipments. The cartel was trying to save what they could while eliminating proof of their operation. Marcus triggered the first sequence of explosions. The facility's power failed as backup backup generators were destroyed, plunging the entire complex into darkness. Security systems crashed, communications were disrupted, and chaos erupted among the cartel forces. Shadow launched into action, targeting key defenders with lethal precision. The dog's combat training made him invisible in the darkness, eliminating threats before they could effectively respond. Marcus moved like a ghost through the facility. His blindness turned to advantage as panicked cartel soldiers fired blindly into the darkness. Each shot revealed their position, allowing him to strike with deadly accuracy. The lieutenant attempted to restore order, shouting commands that Marcus tracked by sound. The cartel soldiers' professional training meant nothing against an opponent who had mastered fighting without sight. Secondary explosions triggered throughout the facility, cutting off escape routes and containing the cartel forces. Marcus had designed the blast pattern to minimize structural damage while creating maximum psychological impact. Shadows growl, warned of approaching reinforcements. Local muscle trying to support their professional counterparts. Their undisciplined fire created more chaos, further disrupting the cartel's attempted evacuation. Marcus moved through the confusion with tactical precision, eliminating key leaders and disrupting command structures. The cartel's organized evacuation devolved into panic as soldiers realized they were trapped in their own facility. His phone vibrated with updates from Detective Martinez. Her containment teams were engaging cartel forces attempting to breach the perimeter. The FBI task force had accelerated their deployment, now 30 minutes out. The lieutenant made his final mistake, attempting to lead a breakout through the main gate. Marcus intercepted him in the darkness, their combat ending with the same lethal efficiency that had kept him alive through countless missions. Shadow returned to Marcus's side as the facility descended into complete chaos. The cartel's forces were divided, their professional operators eliminated, their local muscle breaking under pressure. The evacuation had become a trap. Marcus triggered the final sequence of explosions, sealing the facility's remaining exits. The cartel had brought their operation to Cedar Creek, threatening everything he had fought to protect. Now, they would learn why even their best soldiers feared fighting in darkness. His enhanced hearing tracked the sounds of surrender as cartel soldiers realized their situation was hopeless. Detective Martinez's teams moved in, securing prisoners and evidence that would dismantle the entire organization. Shadow's muscles remained combat-ready as Marcus received confirmation of the FBI task force's arrival. The cartel's attempt to establish a foothold in Cedar Creek had failed. Their professional soldiers were eliminated, their operation exposed, their evidence preserved for prosecution. The war for Cedar Creek was ending, but Marcus remained alert. Experience had taught him that victory often came with hidden costs. The cartel's influence reached far beyond this single facility. His phone delivered final updates from his DEA contact. Federal forces were already moving on connected operations in other towns. The intelligence they had gathered would dismantle the cartel's entire regional network. Shadow's ears as Marcus prepared to withdraw. Their part in this battle was done. The official forces would handle the aftermath, never knowing that a blind veteran and his service dog had made their operation possible. The cartel had chosen Cedar Creek as their battleground, never suspecting that it was defended by a warrior who had mastered the art of fighting in darkness. Their professional soldiers had fallen to an opponent they couldn't effectively target. Marcus reached down to scratch Shadow behind the ears, feeling the combat tension begin to fade from his companion's muscles. They had protected their town, eliminated a deadly threat, and reminded their enemies that sometimes the most dangerous predator was the one they thought was prey. Marcus moved through the secured facility, his enhanced hearing tracking the organized chaos of federal operations. FBI tactical teams swept the buildings while DEA specialists collected evidence. Shadow remained alert at his side, both of them aware that one final threat remained. Police Chief Morgan had disappeared during the initial raid, taking key evidence and several loyal officers with him. The corruption in Cedar Creek's law enforcement ran deeper than anyone had suspected, reaching into federal agencies and political offices. Detective Martinez approached, her footsteps carrying urgency. Morgan's holed up at the police station. He's got hostages, including the mayor. FBI's trying to negotiate, but he's threatening to expose corruption in their ranks. tanks if they move in. Marcus nodded, mapping the situation in his mind. The police station's layout was familiar, its security systems and structural weaknesses catalogued during his earlier reconnaissance. Morgan's position was strong, but not impregnable. How many with him? Marcus asked, already formulating a plan. 6 officers, all compromised. They've barricaded the main entrance and disabled the security cameras. SWAT's on scene, but Morgan claims to have explosives. Shadow's muscles tensed as Marcus absorbed this information. The dog had worked with him to map every entrance to the police station, including routes that didn't appear on official blueprints. Marcus's phone vibrated with an encrypted message from his DEA contact. Morgan's threats weren't empty. He had evidence of corruption reaching into the highest levels of law enforcement. His death would trigger automatic releases of information that could compromise ongoing operations across the country. The FBI won't move, Marcus concluded. They can't risk what Morgan might expose. Martinez's silence confirmed his assessment. The federal response that had helped shut down the cartel was now paralyzed by the threat of exposed corruption. Morgan had turned their own system against them. We can't let him walk away, Martinez said. Not after everything he's done to this town. Marcus reached down to scratch Shadow behind the ears, feeling the same combat tension that had carried them through countless missions. He won't. They moved through Cedar Creek's darkened streets, avoiding the police perimeter established around the station. Morgan's corrupted officers maintained watch positions, but their attention was focused on official threats. They weren't prepared for what was coming. Shadow guided them to their prepared entry point, a maintenance tunnel that connected the station to the town's original infrastructure. Marcus had discovered it during his initial mapping of potential cartel escape routes. His enhanced hearing tracked movement through the building structure. Morgan and his men were concentrated in the main office area, using hostages as human shields. Their positions betrayed nervous tension, the kind that led to fatal mistakes. Marcus triggered a series of distractions he had prepared for this scenario. Power fluctuations, false alarms, and phantom radio signals created confusion among the corrupted officers. Shadow moved silently into position as their discipline began to crack. The first officer fell to Shadow's attack, eliminated before he could raise an alarm. Marcus moved through familiar spaces, his blindness irrelevant in the darkness he had created. Each strike was precise, targeting pressure points and vulnerabilities he had memorized through years of combat. Morgan's voice carried through the building, demanding updates from suddenly silent positions. The police chief's professional facade cracked as he realized something was wrong. His remaining officers bunched closer, making themselves easier targets. Marcus triggered secondary distractions, using the station's own security systems against its defenders. Corrupted officers responded to phantom threats, separating themselves from Morgan's direct control. Shadow eliminated them systematically, years of military training evident in each silent attack. The hostages remained calm, their breathing steady despite the situation. Through the cartel's occupation, they recognized that their salvation would come from Shadows. Morgan's last defenders fell to coordinated strikes from Marcus and Shadow. The police chief's composure shattered as he realized he was alone. His weapon trained wildly on the hostages, threats becoming increasingly desperate. "I'll kill them all," Morgan shouted into the darkness. "You hear me, Stone? Their deaths will be on you." Marcus moved silently through the shadows, tracking Morgan's position by sound. The corrupt chief's ragged breathing and irregular heartbeat betrayed his fear. He knew what was hunting him. "Federal agencies across 3 states will be compromised if I die," Morgan warned. "Criminal investigations will collapse. Careers will be destroyed. Is that what you want?" "What I want," Marcus replied from the darkness, "is justice for Cedar Creek." His strike came from an impossible angle, disarming Morgan before the corrupt chief could react. Shadow secured the weapon as Marcus subdued their final enemy with clinical efficiency. Detective Martinez entered with federal agents as Marcus secured the hostages. Morgan's threats had lost their power. His evidence would be contained, his corruption exposed in ways that wouldn't compromise legitimate operations. Shadow returned to Marcus's side as federal teams processed the scene. The dog's combat tension began to fade, recognizing that their mission was finally complete. Cedar Creek's long nightmare was ending. Marcus's phone delivered final confirmations from his DEA contact. The cartel's network was shattered, their corruption exposed, their influence broken. The town could begin healing from the wounds inflicted. guarded by those sworn to protect it. Martinez approached as the last hostages were evacuated. The FBI's already containing Morgan's evidence. Legitimate operations will be protected while the corruption is excised. Marcus nodded, his enhanced hearing, tracking the organized withdrawal of federal forces. The official story would never mention a blind veteran and his service dog. Their role would remain in shadows, where they operated best. Shadow's ears marked the approach of sunrise as they prepared to leave. Cedar Creek would remember this night, not for the violence that had ended it, but for the justice that had finally been served. The cartel had chosen their town as a battleground, corrupted its protectors, and threatened its citizens. They never suspected that their greatest enemy would be a warrior who had mastered fighting in darkness. Marcus reached down to scratch. Shadow behind the ears, feeling the same bond that had carried them through countless missions. They had defended their home, protected their people, and reminded their enemies that sometimes the most dangerous predator was the one they thought was prey. The war for Cedar Creek was over. Justice had been served in darkness, delivered by a blind veteran and his faithful companion. The town could finally begin to heal. May's diner bustled with morning activity, the familiar sense of coffee and breakfast filling the renovated space. Marcus sat in his usual booth, Shadow resting quietly beneath the table. 2 months had passed since the night that had changed Cedar Creek forever. The diner had become a symbol of the town's recovery. Local businesses had joined together to repair the damage, making it stronger than before. May moved among her customers with renewed confidence, her spirit unbroken by the violence that had touched their community. Marcus's enhanced hearing picked up fragments of normal conversation. Parents discussing school events, workers planning their day, farmers talking about the coming harvest. The fear that had gripped Cedar Creek during the cartel's occupation had been replaced by resilience. Detective Martinez, recently promoted to chief of police, joined him with her morning coffee. Federal task force is finally wrapping up. They've connected the cartel operation to trafficking networks in 3 states. Marcus nodded, tracking the steady rhythm of Cedar Creek's renewed pulse. The town had changed, not just physically, but in spirit. They had faced darkness together and emerged stronger. Morgan's conviction came through yesterday, Martinez continued. His evidence was contained, legitimate operations protected. The corruption is being excised without compromising. Ongoing investigations. Shadow's ears perked up at approaching footsteps. Bill Henderson and his granddaughter stopped by their booth, the young girl slipping Shadow a treat, while Bill shared news about the rail yard's security improvements. The diner's bell chimed as more customers entered. Marcus recognized heartbeats and breathing patterns, mapping the subtle changes in his community. New businesses were opening, families were returning, and Cedar Creek was healing. His phone delivered a final update from his DEA contact. The intelligence they had gathered across the region had led to drug trafficking networks were disrupted, corrupt officials exposed, and communities freed from criminal influence. May brought their usual breakfast order, her movements carrying renewed purpose. Town Council approved the Community Watch program, she reported. Citizens taking responsibility for their own security, working with legitimate law enforcement. Marcus smiled, remembering the night he had first detected Shadow's alert to chemical traces. In this same diner, the cartel had chosen Cedar Creek as their battleground, never suspecting that it was defended by warriors who had mastered fighting in darkness. Shadow pressed against his leg, their bond strengthened by the battles they had faced together. The dog's combat training remained sharp, but his service role had expanded. Local veterans sought them out, finding understanding and support in their shared experiences. Martinez finished her coffee, preparing to start her day leading Cedar Creek's reformed police department. The FBI's impressed with our community and policing initiatives. They're using us as a model for other small towns. The diner continued to fill with morning customers, its rhythms returning to normal. Marcus listened to the subtle harmonies of his community, the blend of familiar voices and new arrivals, creating a stronger whole. His enhanced hearing tracked construction sounds from the warehouse district, where legitimate businesses were reclaiming spaces once controlled by criminals. Cedar Creek had learned valuable lessons about vigilance and community. Shadow's tail thumped gently against the floor as May's grandson brought him fresh water. The boy had overcome his fear of dogs during the crisis, finding strength in the bond between Marcus and his companion. The morning sun warmed the diner's windows as Marcus enjoyed his breakfast. Cedar Creek had faced its darkness and emerged into light. The scars remained, but they had made the community stronger, more resilient, more united. Martinez departed for her duties, her footsteps carrying the confidence of legitimate authority. The corruption that had poisoned Cedar Creek's protectors had been replaced by a renewed commitment to justice. Marcus reached down to scratch Shadow behind the ears, feeling the peaceful contentment that had replaced their combat tension. They had defended their home, protected their people, and reminded their enemies that sometimes the most dangerous predator was the one they thought was prey. May refilled his coffee cup, her movements containing the same strength that had helped her rebuild from destruction. "Will we see you tomorrow morning?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Every morning," Marcus replied, as Shadow settled more comfortably beneath the table. Cedar Creek was their home, and they would always be its guardians, watching from shadows while the community thrived in light. The diner's bell chimed again as life continued its renewed rhythm. Cedar Creek had learned that true strength came from unity, that darkness could be overcome, and that heroes sometimes came in unexpected forms. Marcus and Shadow remained ready, their skills honed by combat, but dedicated to peace. They had shown that justice could emerge from shadows, that disability could become strength, and that a community's heart could overcome any threat. Cedar Creek continued its morning routine, stronger for having faced its trials, more vigilant for knowing its vulnerabilities, more united for having fought its battles together. The town had become a beacon of resilience, a testament to the power of community, and a reminder that sometimes the greatest victories were won in darkness.